and welcome to Varn Vlog. Today, I respond to a challenge. A friend of mine told me today that I get too obsessed with people's origin stories, and including my own, and recounting them, but not asking people what they've learned. And this is a fair critique, actually. People often, and myself included, don't make it clear what they've learned from their experience, and if they've learned anything at all. And people with critiques who don't tell you what they believe in should probably not be entirely trusted. After all, people can agree about the problem of something, but their answer to it can be more diametrically opposed than the problem which they are presented. So this left me thinking, and I'm in a reflective mode. This show's been going on for a little over 2 years. It's changed its format, and there have been a lot of personal changes in my life. Furthermore, I realized that I've been podcasting or doing some kind of left-wing broadcasting now since 2011. I've joined and left 3 or 4 parties. I've been involved in several movements in several countries. But that isn't as important as what I learned from it. Just like what you learn from study. It's not just that you studied, but that you actually gathered information and that you can put it to use. So we'll start with some principles that I learned from study. 1, approach sympathetically and with cognitive empathy to understand someone's mental map, their landscape, and why they believe something. But 2, once you've done that, be willing to be critical of them and yourself. And 3, do not take that criticism as a reason to reject them in whole, or to start being the comrades, or to cut ties. Cutting ties is all too easy in our world, not just politically, but also just personally. One of the strange things about the increase of social media is it actually decreases cognitive empathy. We have thing after thing that shows that. And part of it is overexposure to the superficiality of people's thoughts. And why are they superficial? Because they have to be presented that way. Organic, to use a bad metaphor, because everything's organic, really. But community that has more than one vector, more than the vector of presentation of ideology or self or whatever you present on social media, requires many types of knowledge, many types of interacting, many types of relationships. People have mediated their relationships in ways that have allowed certain skills that they would have naturally just in the world to atrophy in most scenarios. So the cognitive empathy is important to build a mental map of those who you might not agree with, to understand where you might agree, and to be able to use that principle to build something. But also to know where you disagree with them and where your principles have to draw a line. But a principled line does not mean you have to abandon someone or even attack them. But it does mean you need to be honest about what your differences are. The left tendency going back 100 years to self-censorship is not unique to the left. But it is pernicious. Such superficial sectarianism is poisonous. It doesn't allow a movement to grow and to learn. This is important. This is vital. 3. No, actually, I don't know where we're at in numbers, but I'm just going to keep them going. Another thing I've learned is the most common type of social contagion is not release to joy or to pick up some identity. But it's a validation of one's aggression. Mob violence, which I've seen in real life, had to clean it up off of me. It's real. Crowds are smart, believe it or not. The collective is often smarter than the whole when the collective doesn't have a bias standing in its way. That's another thing I've learned. Individuals are specialized. They're limited by their experience and their point of view. They may be smarter than the vast majority of people on a particular topic, but on a general trend, there's no way that they are. There are thousands of people like them in a large mass who have just as many specialities. The way you can learn from that is to combine them together. But the flip side of that, the popular delusions of madness of crowds part, is actually just as interesting. Because what happens is you, for good reason, social censor your aggression. And at times, people just want to take it off. You want to belong to something, and one of the quickest ways to belong to something is to fight something else. Trauma bonding, soldiers, etc. Trust me, I know it. I know it intimately, and it feels good in the moment. Rarely does it actually work out well for you. Another thing I've learned is principles matter, honor matters, ethics matter, morality matters, but don't confuse them with political analysis. You can't make the ought and the is the same just by coming up with an analysis that renders them the same. That's not just confirmation bias. It's a real problem. But it's also true that the oughts actually inform the ises. How you think the world should be really does inform how you see facts. The check on this is if you can ask yourself, is this something that could be a factual truth? Is this something that could be true as a principle? And why are those different things? This brings me to another point. A person, an individual, or a movement is rarely ever purely of quote progressive or reactionary character. These words, they're directional words. But most people move in multiple directions because they are fucking complicated. To not deal with that, to not realize that, and to try to stamp out those contradictions is foolish. What usually brings people in line is mutual benefit, mutual aid, and mutual common future and purpose. Most anthropological understandings of symbolic kinship are based on this. Do we see our futures together? Do we share a common future? That is as thick as blood. And it stems from the same impulse. It's not just what your immediate interests are, it's what your long term interests are. And to those who hate people in a deep way, who see them as all fools and themselves somehow not, you should never trust these people. Yes, individually, people are often moronic, they're often dumb on a thing, on a choice, on a decision, on a political stance, on not seeing how things interconnect, on not seeing the larger systemic vision. Absolutely. But so are you. There's lots of things that people want me to talk about that I increasingly don't. Not out of cowardice, but because I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future a lot of the time. I have good analytics. I have good ways to see predictions, but people who tell you they know this will happen, they do not know. There's always strange attractors. There's always something you don't see, and there's always consequences to a logic that build over time that aren't intended by anyone. Which leads me to another point. Attributing intention where things emerge from complex interactions is foolish. But you should look at where the people who have the most power actually are acting. And why? You need to know all of these people and lives in a real and sensuous way. Not just what people say they are. And never trust someone's writing alone. Never trust someone's statement alone. That's foolish. And it's easy right now because so much of our lives, so much of our actions feel like Mill statements because we live them mediated on machines that give primacy to technological mediation. But our lives are still in the physical world. The reason why I rejected such ideas as techno-neo-feudalism is because you still have to eat, grow food, manage your life. Tech rents will not do that. And it's an ideological illusion that they ever could. If you judge people by who they associate, and I don't think that's actually always a bad heuristic, it's not, however, it's not a truth heuristic. Right, what do I mean by that? Who they associate with doesn't tell you what they believe, but it does tell you what they tolerate. But look at the totality of that, not just the individuals who you like or dislike. And know that beyond all that, even if someone's telling you a truth for a bad reason, it still might be true. Heuristics of suspicion of motives are not useful as a truth criterion. They're useful as a trust criterion. And while those sound like they're the same thing, as truth and trust even have the same kind of roots in our language, they aren't. Sometimes your enemy will be way more honest with you. It's easy to get sucked into the online world, but it's also easy to pretend that it has no effect on your real life. Both of these notions are false. It changes you, just like any experience does, which is why you have to guard your experiences. Another thing I have learned is anyone who tells you that something that seems pernicious in capitalism it needs to be ignored out of self-validation, such as, oh, literacy is not an uncomplicated social good. No, nothing is an uncomplicated social good. Nothing. Those people you should be wary of. Someone who tells you you are okay, regardless of what capitalism does to you, it's just validating you. And if people offer you easy answers, oh, if we just printed money, oh, if we just did this, ask them how the systemic effects move throughout the system. Often they're right in part, but they're wrong in the big picture. And the big picture is actually what matters. I talk about this with financial schemes all the time. Is MNT incorrect? No, but you have to look at the power dynamics. The idea that it's just bad ideology driving this and people don't know what they're doing, that's foolish. Also, the idea that you can do any of this without social cost, if it's just a closed system in which the government can act, that's not just being foolish, it's false. But that's, why pick on just MMTers? There's thousands of these things. Oh, if we only build a party uh, with the right ideology, how do you know what the right ideology is? Only if we can only prefigure our society. Well, I agree with you that you should not act in ways that violate your principles when you're building what you want to build. Um, but stuff doesn't scale the same way. Principles don't work the same way at every level of society, which is why so many of these localist or even national first acts get stuck in cul-de-sacs because the scales don't make sense. The people who try to change the stuff at the way of the nation haven't built up the power bases and systemic institutions that would support that, even if they got power. I learned that from watching the Muslim Brotherhood, which did way more dual power work than most leftist organizations have ever done, definitely during the Bernie campaign. And they still didn't have the institutions. And what happened to them? Those institutions overthrew them. You cannot rid yourself of bureaucratic elites unless you systematize what they do, and you still need the expertise. My vision of the world has always been based on allowing people who had the expertise to rise up. But what I've actually always seen is oligarchical capture. There are ways out of it on small scale institutions, but I have literally racked my brain for years turning to cybernetics, turning to anthropology, turning to this, that, or the other to figure out how you do that, how you make leadership actually accountable, how you make programs, political programs and whatnot, actually flexible and bendable and emerge from the people who they're supposed to serve. Lastly, stridency without discipline is not militancy, it's indulgence. It makes you feel like you're doing something when you're screaming into the void. It makes you feel like your smugness means something when it's just you coping. That's what I've learned. These words that we throw around can play all kinds of havoc on you. And trying to make them consistent or to insist on some platonic meaning like if as if they were quantitative numbers and not emergent concepts in a complicated social system which is always changing. Well, how do you think that's going to go for you? How has it gone? Particularly when you think even in their metaphors, many of these words are relative. And many of them describe abstract systems of which there is not common agreement. Do not let people fool you with mere and empty semiotics. And in lieu of that, people who feel powerless will over identify with partisanship because they think identifying with something with power will give them power. It is almost like sympathetic magic. This is a deep human trait. It is not modern. It is not just from our parasocially induced mega internet world. It is deeper than that. I have become more and more critical at the Frankfurt School and whatnot as I get older, and become more critical of most things in the left, frankly. My reasons for not being super appealed to by the right is I don't necessarily see the metaphysical background, and now that they don't have a metaphysical background, all I see is resentment. Ironically, so many of the Nietzscheans prove Nietzsche's own primary critique of Christianity, progressivism, and liberalism that is driven by resentment. Looking at a time period where Republicans may even destroy the power of the dollar just to prove a point, just for a little bit of leverage, because it's the only leverage they really have. I've really been forced to reflect on all this. I've also seen it on the left, who instead of realizing that they have put themselves in a cul-de-sac, keep on making more and more elaborate ideological and theoretical excuses for it, for why that they don't need independence, or why their prior delusions means that they just have to metaphorically and sometimes literally learn to love the bomb, or the Democratic Party, or Joe Biden. Do not take disagreements over fact over disagreements of principle. You should be able to tell the two apart. And if you can't, that's a problem. We live in a time of increasing danger, and where people really want there to be heroes when there are none. When the adults in the room are geriatric centrists who can't let go of power but literally haven't even built a backbench to replace themselves. Not in the Bonapartist strongman way that we always talk about, although that happened in the Soviet Union. Thank you, Joseph Stalin. But also in this milquetoast world that we live in. Our bourgeoisie are not the bourgeoisie of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. However craven they may have been, they were competent. Ours are not. Our professionals and managers and the 5% that serve them are also less competent. And we see this throughout the whole system, down to the worker. Nobody is removed from that. So this brings me to the last point that I've learned. People who try to tell you that you can radically pick part of the system, like we need to abolish this or that, or we need this or that, or this other thing, auditing the Fed, or people's money, or one quick fix of a system, are ignoring the entire system for a part of it they feel like they can change. It sounds radical, but actually does very little. And what is depressing about it is it makes any change harder. Reform or revolution was never a clear binary. But opportunism and entryism tends to change you more than you change what you're entering. There's a lot that I have learned over the past decade and a half, 40 odd years of life. Hope you get something out of it. I hope you apply it. I'd like to thank my new patrons. I owe some of them, and I am a man of rules. Sometimes to a fault, but what is owed is what is owed. So, On that note, let me thank them. I'd like to thank Christopher S. for becoming a Uncle Han, and I'd like to thank my 400 something patrons for helping me do this. As you noticed, we went through a flurry of activity, and I mentioned why I kind of dove into work after my father died, and I have some other personal stuff that I will be handling in the next few months. It may affect things even by the time you see this video. I'm not going to get into it. It's personal, but it may change the release schedule even more. But I've recorded a lot for you guys, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you learn from it. And that is all I have to say. Have a good day.